Hi, this is Freddy, also known as Seven Secrets. I'm going to be reading This Is Not a Program by Tiqqun, which is published by Semiotics. It's an ultra-leftist French text. Particularly, it's concerned with the movement of 77 in Italy, and analyzes a lot to do with insurrectionism and the effects of the socialist and social democrat movement on the more anarchist or left communist insurrectionist movement in Italy at the time. Also with regards to French insurrectionism in a similar period, and it's very critical of the May 68 movement in France. The blurb says, historical conflict no longer opposes two massive molar heaps, two classes, the exploited and the exploiters, the dominant and the dominated, managers and workers, among which, in each individual case, one could differentiate. The front line no longer cuts through the middle of society, it now runs through the middle of each of us. I so apologise that my headphones are going to be hanging in the shot for this entire thing. I'm in my university dorm room at the moment, so it's very difficult for me to set up a good way of filming. This is the first chapter. I'm probably going to read the first chapter and then film another section in another video instead, and continue like that. Redefine historical conflict. I don't believe that ordinary people think that in the short run there is any risk of a sudden, violent dissolution of the state, of open civil war. What is gaining ground instead is the idea of a latent civil war, to borrow a journalistic expression, the idea of a civil war of position that would strip the state of all legitimacy. That's from Terrorisme et Démocratie, from Éditions Sociales. I'm sorry, I'm probably going to pronounce all of these French words with a very slight Spanish accent instead, because that's the language which I'm familiar with. Also because French is incredibly difficult to pronounce if you don't know it. Once again, blind experimentation, with no protocol or almost none. We have been left so little, this may be our chance. Once again, direct action, sheer destruction, out-and-out confrontation, the refusal of any kind of mediation. Those who don't refuse to understand will get no explanation from us. Again, the desire, the plane of consistency of everything that several decades of counter-revolution have repressed. Again, all this. Autonomy, punk, riot, orgy, but original, mature, thought out, clear of the petty convolutions of the new. Through arrogance, international police operations and communiques declaring permanent victory, a world presented as the only world possible, as the crowning achievement of civilization, has finally been made thoroughly abominable. A world which had believed it had completely insulated itself has discovered evil at its core among its children. A world which celebrated a common new year as a change of millennium has begun to fear for its millennium. A world long settled in the house of catastrophe now warily grasps that the fall of the socialist bloc didn't pretend its triumph, but rather its own ineluctable collapse. A world gorged with the clamours of the end of history, the American century, and the failure of communism is now going to have to pay for its frivolity. In the present paradoxical situation, this world, that is to say, essentially its police, has constructed for itself a fitting and fittingly extravagant enemy. It talks of a black bloc, of a travelling anarchist circus, of a vast conspiracy against civilization. One is reminded of von Salomon's Germany and the Outlaws, a Germany obsessed by the fantasy of a secret organisation, the OC, which spreads like a cloud loaded with gas, and to which they attribute all the dazzling confusion of a reality given over to civil war. A bad conscience tries to exercise the power that threatens it. It creates a bogey that it can make faces at, and thinks safety is thereby assured. That sounds about right, doesn't it? Despite the flights of fancy of the imperial police, current events have no strategic legibility. They have no strategic legibility because if they did, that would imply something common. something minimally common between us, and that, a common, makes everyone afraid, makes Bloom turn away. It stuns and strikes dumb because it restores something unequivocal to the very heart of our suspended lives. We have become accustomed to contracts for everything. We have avoided everything resembling a pact because a pact cannot be rescinded. It is either respected or broken. And in the end, that is the hardest thing to understand, that the effect of a negation depends on the positivity of a common, that our way of saying I determines the force with which we say no. Often we are surprised by the break in historical transmission, a break arising from the fact that for at least 50 years, no parent has been able to talk about his life to his children to turn his life into history, histoire. A history that isn't simply a discontinuum coloured with pathetic anecdotes. What has in fact been lost is the ability to establish a communicable relationship between our history and history as such. At the heart of all this is the belief that by renouncing every singular existence, by surrendering all purpose, we might finally get a little peace. Blooms believed that it was enough to abandon the battlefield for the war to end, but nothing like that happened. War didn't stop, and those who have refused as much now find themselves a bit more disarmed, a bit more disfigured than the rest. This is the source of the resentments that now broil in Bloom's balls, and from which springs the insatiable desire to see heads roll, to finger the guilty, to secure a kind of general repentance for all of history past. A redefinition of historical conflict is needed, not intellectually, vitally. I say redefinition because a definition of historical conflict precedes us, in which every existence in the pre-imperial period has its part, the class struggle. That definition no longer holds. It condemns us to paralysis, bad faith, and empty talk. No war can now be waged, no life lived in this straitjacket from another age. To continue the struggle today, we will have to scrap the notion of class, and with it the whole entourage of certified origins, reassuring sociologisms, and identity prophecies. The notion of class is only good for holding like a little bedpan neuroses, separation, and perpetual recrimination in which they have taken such morbid delight in France, in every segment of society, for such a long time. Historical conflict no longer opposes two massive molar heaps, two classes, the exploited and the exploiters, the dominant and the dominated, managers and workers, among which, in each individual case, one could differentiate. The front line no longer cuts through the middle of society. It now runs through the middle of each of us, between what makes us a citizen, our predicates, and all the rest. It is thus in each of us that war is being waged between imperial socialization and that which already eludes it. A revolutionary process can be set in motion from any point of the biopolitical fabric, from any singular situation, by exposing, even breaking, the line of flight that traverses it. Insofar as such processes, such ruptures occur, one plane of consistency is common to all of them, that of anti-imperial subversion. The generality of the struggle specifically derives from the system of power itself, from all the forms in which power is exercised and applied. We have called this plane of consistency the imaginary party, so that in its very name, the artifice of its nominal and a fortiori political representation is clear. Like every plane of consistency, the imaginary party is at once already present and yet to be built. Building the party no longer means building a total organisation within which all ethical differences might be set aside for the sake of a common struggle. Today, building the party means establishing forms of life in their difference, intensifying, complicating relations between them, developing as subtly as possible civil war between us. Because the most formidable stratagem of empire lies in its throwing everything that opposes it into one ugly heap of barbarism, sects, terrorism, or conflicting extremisms. Fighting against empire essentially means never confusing the conservative segments of the imaginary party, libertarian militias, right-wing anarchists, insurrectionary fascists, Qutbist jihadists, ruralist militants, and its revolutionary experimental segments. Building the party must therefore no longer be thought of in terms of organisation, but in terms of circulation. In other words, if there is still a problem of organisation, the problem is organising the circulation within the party. For only the continuation and intensification of encounters between us can further the process of ethical polarisation, can further the building of the party. It is true that a passion for history is generally the fate of bodies incapable of living the present. Nonetheless, I don't consider it off-topic to return to the apparatus of the cycle of struggle initiated in the early 1960s, now that another cycle has begun. In the pages that follow, numerous references will be made to 1970s Italy. This is not an arbitrary choice. If I weren't afraid of going on too long, I would easily show how what was then at stake, in the starkest and most brutal terms, largely remains so for us, although today's climate is, for the time being, less extreme. As Guattari wrote in 1978, rather than consider Italy as a special case, captivating but all things considered aberrant, shouldn't we in fact seek to shed light on the other, apparently more stable social, political, and economic situations originating in more secure state power through a reading of the tensions currently at work in that country? 1970s Italy remains, in every respect, the insurrectional moment closest to us. We must start there, not in order to write the history of a past movement, but to hone the weapons of the war currently taking place. Because that was relatively short, I'm going to complete reading the second chapter as well. I'm just going to take a quick break, just here. I'm going to continue from where I left off, read the next 2 chapters, because the previous chapter only took about 10 minutes to read, and I want to fill up enough time, so that it isn't too short a video. Free oneself from mortification. Those of us who provisionally operate in France don't have it easy. It would be absurd to deny that the conditions in which we operate are determined, and even bloody well determined. Beyond the fanaticism for separation which sovereign state education has ingrained in bodies, and which makes school the shameful utopia hammered into every French skull, there is this distrust, this impossible-to-shake distrust of life, of everything that exists unapologetically, and there is the retreat from the world into art, philosophy, the home, food, spirituality, critique, as the exclusive and impracticable line of flight on which the thickening flows of local mortification feed. An umbilical retreat that calls for the omnipresence of the French state, that despotic schoolmaster, which now seems even to govern citizen protests. Thus the great din of spineless, crippled and twisted French minds, which never stop whirling round within themselves, every second feeling more threatened, sensing that something might wake them from their complacent misery. Nearly everywhere in the world, debilitated bodies have some historical icon of resentment on which to cling, some proud fascistoid movement that has decked out in grand style the coat of arms of the reaction. Nothing doing in France. French conservatism has never had any style, because it is a bourgeois conservatism, a gut conservatism. That it has finally risen to the rank of pathological reflexivity changes nothing. It isn't driven by its love for a dying world, but by its terror of experimentation, of life experimentation. This conservatism, the ethical substratum of specifically French bodies, takes precedence over any kind of political position, over any kind of discourse. It establishes the existential continuity, a declared as much as hidden continuity, that ensures that Beauvais, the 17th century arrondissement bourgeois, the pencil pusher of the Encyclopédia des Nuances, I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced, and the provincial notable all belong to the same party. It matters little, then, that the bodies in question voice reservations about the existing order. The same passion for origins, forests, pastures, and village life is currently on display in opposition to worldwide financial speculation, and tomorrow it will stifle even the smallest movement for revolutionary deterritorialization. Regardless of where, those who speak solely from the gut exhale the same smell of shit. Of course, France wouldn't be the country of world citizenism. No doubt in a not-too-distant future, Le Monde Diplomatique will be translated into more languages than capital, the ridiculous epicenter of phobic opposition that claims to challenge the market in the name of the state, had they not managed to make themselves so utterly impervious to all that is politically actual, and particularly impervious to 1970s Italy. From Paris to Porto Alegre, in country after country, the global expansion of attack bears witness to this Blumesque craze for quitting the world. And here's a lovely picture of an upturned car and some burning rubbish, and a man crouching. Creeping May versus Triumphant May. 77 wasn't like 66. 66 was anti-establishment. 77 was radically alternative. This is why the official vision portrays 68 as good and 77 as bad. In fact, 68 was co-opted, whereas 77 was annihilated. This is why, unlike 68, 77 could never make for an easy object of celebration. That's from Nanni Bellastrini, Primo Moroni, L'ora d'Oro. 77 is referring to the 77 movement in Italy, and 68 to the May 68 uprisings, mainly in Paris by students. On several occasions over the course of the 1970s, the insurrectionary situation in Italy threatened to spread to France. It would last more than 10 years, and they would finally put an end to it with the arrest of more than 4,000 people. First, there were the wildcat strikes during the hot autumn of 1969, which Empire quashed in the Piazza Fontana bombing massacre. The French, whose working class took up the red flag of proletarian revolution from the students' delicate hands, only in order to sign the Grenelle Accords, couldn't believe that a movement originating in the universities could reach all the way to the factories. With all the bitterness of their abstract relationship with the working class, they felt deeply offended because their May came out sullied as a result. So they called the Italian situation Creeping May. 10 years later, at a time when we were ready to celebrate the memory of the French May, and at a time when its most resolute actors had already quietly found jobs within Republican institutions, new rumblings again came from Italy. These were more obscure, both because pacified French minds were already at a loss to understand much about a war in which they had, nevertheless, been engaged, and because contradictory rumours sometimes mentioned prison revolts, sometimes an armed counterculture, sometimes the Red Brigades, BR, among all the other things that were a bit too physical for them to understand in France. We pricked up our ears, just out of curiosity, then we turned back to our petty concerns, telling ourselves that those Italians sure were naive to continue the revolt when we had already moved on to commemoration. They settled back into denunciations of the Gulag, the crimes of communism and other delights of the new philosophy. They thereby avoided seeing that the Italians were revolting against what May 68 had become, for example, in France. Grasping that the movement in Italy challenged the profs who glorified in their May 68 past, because they were in reality the most fervent champions of social democratic standardization. That surely would have given the French an unpleasant taste of immediate history. Honour intact, they therefore became all the more certain of a creeping May, thanks to which they could pack away the movement of 77 with the souvenirs of another age, a movement from which everything is no less still to come. Kojève, who was unmatched and cut into the heart of the matter, offered a nice turn of phrase to put the French May to rest. During a meeting of the OECD, a few days before he died of a heart attack, he observed of the events. There were no deaths. Nothing happened. Naturally, a bit more was needed to inter Italy's creeping May. Then another Hegelian surfaced, who had acquired no less a reputation than the first, but through different means. He said, listen, nothing happened in Italy. Just some dead-enders manipulated by the state who wanted to terrorize the population by kidnapping some politicians and killing some judges. As you can see for yourselves, nothing exceptional. In this way, thanks to Guy Debord's shrewd intervention, on this side of the Alps we have never known that something happened in Italy in the 1970s. To this day, French luminaries have accordingly confined themselves to platonic speculations concerning the manipulation of the BR by this or that state service and the Piazza Fontana massacre. If Debord was an execrable middleman for all that was explosive in the Italian situation, he nonetheless introduced France to the favourite sport of Italian journalism, retrology. For the Italians, retrology, a discipline whose first axiom might be, the truth is elsewhere, refers to this paranoid game of mirrors, played by those who no longer believe in any event, in any vital phenomenon, and who, consequently, that is, as a consequence of their illness, must always imagine someone or some group hidden behind what happens, the P2 Lodge, the CIA, Mossad, or even they themselves. The winner is the one who has given his little playmates the best reasons to doubt reality. It is thus easier to understand why the French speak of a creeping May when it comes to Italy. They have the proud public May, the state May. In Paris, May 68 has served as the symbol of the 60s and 70s world political antagonism to the exact extent that the reality of this antagonism lies elsewhere. No effort was spared, however, in transmitting to the French a bit of the Italian insurrection. There were 1,000 plateaus and molecular revolution. There were autonomy and the squat movement. But nothing had enough power to break through the walls of lies of the French spirit. nothing that they can claim not to have foreseen. Instead, they prefer to chatter on about the Republic, education, social security, culture, modernity and social relations, suburban unrest, philosophy and the public sector. And this is what they chatter on about, just as the imperial services resurrect Italy's strategy of tension. Clearly, there is an elephant missing from the glassworks. Someone to state the obvious, to come out with it somewhat coarsely and once and for all, even if it means smashing up the place a bit. Here I would like to speak to the comrades, among others, to those with whom I can share the party. I am a little fed up with the comfortable theoretical backwardness of the French ultra-left. I am fed up with hearing the same fake debates with their rhetorical sub-Marxism, spontaneity or organisation, communism or anarchism, the human community or unruly individuality. There are still Bourdigists, Maoists and councilists in France, not to mention the periodic Trotskyist revivals and situationist folklore. That's all I'm going to read today, but this is the next chapter which I'll be reading, which is a few more pages. I'll keep reading from there. I think those chapters lay out a lot of what's to come in the book, so you'll see. Thank you.